In this video, I am doing Krugman and Wells, page 128, 6b, and I will focus specifically on producer surplus. So in this problem, they tell us that the willingness to pay for each buyer drops by $20 when a new edition is released. This requires us to redo our demand and supply schedule. So first of all, I'm going to indicate the drop in the price of the book by $20. So I'm just going to simply cross out the price of the book and replace it by a willingness to pay that's $20 lower. I'm not going to change the quantity of books demanded because the same amount of consumers demand books, but just as at $20 lower. So as long as I change the price to $20 lower, I can keep my demand schedule the way it is. So I will just go ahead and make those changes all the way down the demand and supply schedule. So I've now made those changes. I now need to reconsider my supply schedule because just because buyers have dropped their willingness to pay by $20 does not mean that suppliers will accommodate them. So I need to use the old supply schedule to make the new one. So to do that, I ask myself, okay, well, the first seller that I had came in at the price of $60. So that would be right here. So the first seller came in at $60. Prior to that, we had no sellers willing to sell at a price of less than $60. So what I can really do is just think about shifting this, shifting the supply schedule downwards so that the first seller comes in at this new price of $60. This is $20 less than the price I had before, which was $80. And so then I can just kind of go down the line and say, okay, 3 come in at $65. I have 3 suppliers at $70. No more came in. I have 3 more that came in at the price of $75. I have 3 more that came in at the price of $80. 1 more that came in at the price of $85, and 8 more that came in at the price of $90. So from here now, I'm going to consider what the graphical representation of producer surplus might look like. And I'll do this first because I think it's easier to build an intuition from when we move to the algebraic calculation. It'll be easier to refer back to the graph to show us what we're doing. So I've set up my axes in order to start graphing the information that is given to me through the supply schedule. And so I'll just start, putting in my entries. At the price of $60, we have 1 seller who is willing to come into the market and sell for that price. So at $60, then I will mark that I have 1 seller coming into the market. Then at the price of $65, I have 2 more who come into the market for a total of 3 sellers in the market at the price of $65. So I will now put that in. Okay. All right, and then at $70, I don't actually have anybody coming into the market to sell any more books. So I will just not mark that at all. But when I move to 75, all of a sudden, I then have 3 more sellers come into the market to sell their books. So at 75, I'll just mark that I have a total of 6 sellers in the market. And I'll just continue in that way until I get to $90. So I've just gone ahead and filled in all that information. So now I'm going to consider the actual price that the books are sold in this market, and that's still going to be at equilibrium. But now our equilibrium has changed to $75. So I'm just going to mark an equilibrium price in the market of $75. Okay. Now, my producer surplus is going to be the difference between the price at which the books were actually sold and the least that the sellers were willing to sell those books, or what we have understood in micro to be their cost. Now, if I want to represent that graphically, it's going to be the area there and there. So I need to calculate that area. Well, in that first rectangle, I have a width of 1 and I have a height of 15. In other words, I have one seller who was willing to sell at 60. That would be this seller right here. One seller willing to sell at 60, and they actually sold at 15. So that one seller actually produced a surplus. The market generated a surplus for that seller of 1 times 15, which is just 15. I then had 2 more sellers come into the market when the market price of a book increased to $65. So those 2 sellers came in. That's the shift from here to here. And they were willing to sell at 65, but they were actually able to sell their books for 75. So each one of them, for each one of them, the market generated a producer surplus of $10. And so I need to calculate the area here, and it's 2 times 10. 10 being the difference in the the difference between what they were willing to sell and what they actually sold, or the height of this second rectangle, and times 2, which is the amount of sellers who actually received that surplus as a result of that market interaction. So I have 2 times 10, which is just 20. And so my total producer surplus is just the sum of these 2 areas, 15 plus 20, which gives me a total surplus of $35 that the market generated for producers. Okay, so I've arranged the information to calculate this algebraically, and I've shrunk the graph that we created to just sort of link up what we're doing algebraically with the graph. You'll see that I've created 4 new columns, and that is just to organize our information and the way we think about the producer surplus as we move along. So I've created a column that tells me how much the book was actually sold for. Now, in this market, they've asked us to consider the market price at equilibrium. So at this new equilibrium, when the willingness to pay of consumers dropped by $20, we have an equilibrium of $75. That's where quantity of books demanded equals the quantity of books supplied. And in both cases, it's 6. 6 books demanded, 6 books supplied. So the actual selling price then is $75 all down the line. Then I've simply relisted everyone's willingness to sell. So I've essentially just copied the new information that I put down in the very first column and just relisted it in this new second column. In the third column, I've put the number of sellers who are actually who have come into the market willing to sell at these prices. So you'll notice this is not the total number of sellers, but rather how many more sellers come into the market as we move the market price of books up. So for instance, from $35 to $55, we have no sellers willing to sell at those prices. It's too low for them. Then we have one seller come into the market when the price of the book moves to $60. We have 2 more come into the market when it moves to $65. We have no more come in when it bumps up to $70. 3 more when it moves up to $75. 3 more when it moves up to $80, and so on. Now, my last column that I've created is the producer surplus. You'll notice, actually, and I can probably just put dashes all along here, you'll notice that I've kind of, just already sort of blocked out the rows where I know I'm not going to calculate a producer surplus. In the first 5 rows, I know I'm not going to calculate a producer surplus because there are actually no sellers who are willing to sell their books at those prices from $35 to $55. From the price of $80 to $90, I do have sellers who would be willing to sell their books at that price, but remember that the market price was $75. So all three of these sellers are out of the market. They are not willing to sell their books at the low price for them of $75. So I really only have a producer surplus generated for those sellers who were willing to pay, who were willing to sell below the market price of $75. So now I'm going to go ahead and calculate that producer surplus. So I have in this first, open row, I have one seller who was willing to sell at 60, but actually sold at 75. So for that one seller, a producer surplus was generated of 75 minus 60, which is 15, times one seller. So I only get 15. Now, that links up with the area of the first rectangle that I illustrated to you in the graph of producer surplus. Moving down the line, I have two sellers who were willing to sell at 75, who actually sold their books at 75. So for each one of those sellers, the market generated a producer surplus of $10. So I have $10 produced for two sellers. So 10 times 2 gives me total surplus of 20. Now, I had no more sellers coming into the market to sell at 70, and so there's no producer surplus generated there. And then I have three more sellers willing to sell their book at $75. Now, they were willing to sell and the market at 75, and the market price was 75. So though they did sell their books, there was actually no producer surplus generated for them, because the willingness that they had to sell exactly matches the amount that they actually sold for. So algebraically, that's simply 75 minus 75, which is 0, times 3 is still 0. So now when I want to calculate the total producer surplus, I am just simply going to add up all of these, all of the surplus generated, which will be 15 plus 20 plus 0, which gives me a total surplus, producer surplus of $35 generated, which exactly matches the calculation that I did graphically.